Our scripture reading this morning comes from Matthew chapter 10, verses 16 to 33. Behold, I am sending you out as sheep in the midst of wolves, so be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. Beware of men, for they will deliver you over to courts and flog you in their synagogues, and you will be dragged before governors and kings for my sake, to bear witness before them and the Gentiles. When they deliver you over, do not be anxious how you are to speak or what you are to say, for what you are to say will be given to you in that hour. For it is not you who speak, but the Spirit of your Father speaking through you. Brother will deliver brother over to death, and the father his child. And children will rise against parents and have them put to death. And you will be hated by all for my name's sake. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. When they persecute you in one town, flee to the next, for truly I say to you, you will not have gone through all the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes. A disciple is not above his teacher, nor a servant above his master. It is enough for the disciple to be like his teacher, and the servant like his master. If they have called the master to the house of Beelzebul, how much more will they malign those of his household? So have no fear of them, for nothing is covered that will not be revealed, or hidden that will not be known. What I tell you in the dark, say in the light, and what you hear whispered, proclaim on the housetops. Do not fear those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather, fear him who can destroy both soul and body in hell. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? And not one of them will fall to the ground apart from your Father. But even the hairs of your head are all numbered. Fear not, therefore, you are of more value than many sparrows. See, everyone who acknowledges me before men, I will acknowledge before my Father who is in heaven. But whoever denies me before men, I also will deny before my Father who is in heaven. This is the word of our Lord.
I want you to think about something as we begin with this passage. I wonder what it might be like to coach someone running for political office today. Just think about that. If you're a young man or a young woman who thinks you may one day run for political office, we already know it's scrappy territory out there. None of us need journalists or political correspondents to tell us that the divide between political positions is enormously vast right now. Convincing someone of your position on the issues is no easy feat, especially given that the distance between one political position and another seems to be light years of barren land. Not just an American thing. Across Europe, political positions are drifting further and further apart so that there's hardly any room at all in the middle for civil discussion or for comparison of views. It's just one big battlefield, isn't it? 2 trenches of opposing views. And by the way, aren't we all looking forward to election season this year? We're just so excited about it. Polarizing views with a battlefield in the middle isn't terribly unusual, is it? As a kind of a playful example, think of much of sports culture. Sports culture is like this. Team rivalry runs so deep in our veins that we can't imagine the circumstances in which we would root for a rival team. Again, perhaps a playful illustration. Some of you come from families who have been passionately devoted to one football team for generations. Common decency, would dictate that anyone who comes to your house for any reason at all better not wear a shirt of the opposing team. They should just know better. Politics has something in common with sports, but let's just be honest. We can see the same kind of division in family lives. Some of our families are filled with polarizing opinions about all kinds of things, not just politics and sports. All of us, each one of us individually, can become remarkably committed to our opinions about politics or sports or our college or our company or nationhood or social issues or, let's face it, religion. What kind of power must be involved for someone committed to one position to actually, give thought and consideration to a position on the absolute other side of their universe? It may be that this is the greatest divide for which no one is immune. We love our opinions. And by the way, if you think that you are immune to this because you are open to any and all religious opinions and contentedly neutral in your participation of all things religious, would you consider that your neutrality is itself, it's an opinion? And it's something that you are at odds with others about. Nobody is neutral, and any claim to neutrality, it's just ignoring the fact that every human being has some kind of religious position. That's actually a really good setting for this passage. Because in this passage, Jesus, he's coaching his disciples on what it looks like to engage an ethnically and religiously Jewish people who do not believe that the Messiah has come. They are happily content waiting for the future Messiah. They may be dreaming about him. They certainly have expectations of what he must be like, but they are very unlikely to believe that a poor, unknown carpenter from the no-name city of Nazareth is that Messiah. And Jesus, he's saying to his disciples, when you engage people like that, here's how you should do it. That's what the passage is about. In fact, the passage is saying this: you will be persecuted as a Christian, yet still victorious. That's what this passage is about. You will be persecuted as a Christian, but still victorious. You see, various parts of this passage taken by themselves could not be more deflating to the disciples. Jesus seems to be utterly convinced that to engage individuals with a competing position will be the surest path to their own persecution and death. Look what he says in verse 28. Do not fear those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul. And the death that comes will be a death that will feel like betrayal. Look at verse 21. Siblings versus siblings, parents versus children. What comfort Jesus is offering to the disciples. Now go out there and die. You know, Jesus, he knows his disciples. He knows us. And he's not unaware of our hesitation to share the gospel with others. He knows that he is sending these 12 Jewish men into a dangerous battlefield between opposing positions. Now, he knows that what he's about to tell them is not intuitive. You will be persecuted, but still victorious. And Jesus begins by talking about the attitude that these disciples must have. And then he moves on to their motivation, and then finally, their hope. Attitude, motivation, and hope that these sheep need to carry with them, even or especially among wolves. Well, 3 points to the sermon. The first main point is going to be longer. They all get shorter, I assure you of that. But verses 16 through 23, it's about the kind of attitude that these sheep need to have amidst wolves. And you could summarize that attitude with calm patience. Calm patience. You see there in verse 19, or you see in verse 16 rather, behold, I am sending you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. We ought to be able to hear several of the disciples right at this moment thinking to themselves, or maybe even bringing it up, articulating it loudly, well, if that's the case, Jesus, what's the point? When has anyone seen a sheep defeat a wolf, not to mention a pack of wolves? When the pack arrives, there's going to be blood, and it's not going to fare well for the sheep. And yet, this is what Jesus begins with. And then this expression at the tail end of verse 16, be wise as serpents and innocent as doves, surely brings very little comfort to the disciples, partly because it's really difficult to understand what in the world Jesus is talking about. I mean, of course, we don't ordinarily admire snakes for a kind of wisdom that they possess. We don't admire them for anything, I don't think. In the ancient world, however, one quality of a snake that was admired was that they were cunning. The snakes, they tend to stay out of your way. You almost don't know that they're present. They're able to hide in very small places. And when they do have the power to harm, oftentimes they don't use that power indiscriminately. Even when engaged in battle, snakes tend to move slowly. They strategize, they plan. And this may be what Jesus was after when he talks about the wisdom of serpents, but it's pretty elusive, this metaphor that Jesus is using, but maybe a snake ought to conjure up an image of the kind of creature that thinks and plans, that uses its head, that strategizes. And the innocence of doves might be a little bit easier to imagine, but not much. The disciples would have understood that in the ancient world, doves were known to be virtuous. I don't know if biologists agree with that at all, but this word that Jesus uses for innocent is a word that means single-mindedness, a focus on the task at hand. And so what Jesus may have had in mind is a kind of patience that the dove has. The serpent and the dove, when you put these together and you create this kind of mythical creature that is immensely good and thoughtful at strategy and immensely wise about the big picture, is this enough to give the disciples great confidence as they are sent into a pack of wolves as sheep? I'm not convinced. And I'm fairly sure the disciples, they're not convinced either. Before solving this riddle, we need to pay attention to what Jesus says in all of these verses together, 16 through 23. But notice right off the bat that Jesus describes some of the circumstances into which these disciples are going to find themselves. Jesus doesn't say you're going into a pack of wolves. He actually describes what it's going to look like. And Jesus, he doesn't hold back. He doesn't edit it down. And really what he's doing is he's showing the gravity of the situation that he might then show the necessity of the attitude. But just notice the situation. All of these circumstances, Jesus, he bundles them all together really with the words in verse 17, beware of men. That's easy, isn't it? Beware of men. I mean, this phrase alone couldn't be more ominous. He doesn't say beware of bad men or cantankerous men or men who really love the rival religion or men who are particularly litigious. He says beware of men, and he almost may as well beware of all men. When you look at verse 22, isn't that what Jesus says? You will be hated by all men. The danger's all but guaranteed. It can come from all directions. And just listen to the four circumstances that Jesus describes before he describes the attitudes that they'll need. First, he has the setting of a court. You see there, verse 17, they'll deliver you to the courts. It's just like then, it was just like it is today. This would very likely be a long, drawn-out, and expensive process. It certainly would have been an unfair experience that would most likely damage your reputation and the reputation of your family as well. Keep in mind what we've learned from verse 7 last week, that the center of the disciples' ministry is a proclamation of the kingdom of heaven, and that kingdom of heaven is at hand. And that proof that you believe that the kingdom of heaven is at hand is that you have faith in Jesus, that you become a follower of Jesus. That's the message. And that very message, Jesus says, is going to land you in court. But it's not just a court, it's a synagogue. It's probably easier to believe the latter half of verse 17. You'll be flogged in the synagogue. You'll be flogged by synagogue officials. You publicly proclaim this doctrine that's very different from the synagogue. You're just going to be publicly beaten as an example to others. From the court to the synagogue to politics, you see in verse 18, he says to the disciples that you'll be dragged before governors and kings. And the word dragged is very telling. It means that whoever are the local officials of the city are going to take it upon themselves to physically arrest you and transport you to the highest authority that they can get you to. It may be miles from the village, but you'll be arrested before the transport begins. Court, synagogue, politics. But worse than any of those fields of battle is the family. You see in verse 21 that family will be no guarantee of safety. If a man or a woman becomes a follower of Jesus through the proclamation of the kingdom, the sibling of that man or woman, the parents of that man or woman, or the children of that man or woman, or all of them together, may come and put their family member to death, or may come and put the preacher of that message to death. Family bond is not going to be strong enough to prevent the wolves from acting. Jesus must mean that this is true even for the disciples' own families. Now, those are the circumstances. You see, he's not, Jesus, toning down the reality of those circumstances. It's difficult to know how to think about this, really. I mean, it's difficult to know if Jesus is saying something that's always going to happen or if this is a potentiality that this might happen. But the language in English and in the original language, the language itself is very strong. And we might affirm that not every proclamation of a follower of Jesus is going to lead to a persecution like this. But when we look at God's word, we need to take seriously the seriousness of Jesus' language. And here's why I think his language is so stern. Jesus wants us to see against this black future the brightness of the Christian's attitude in this ministry. He commands a couple of attitudes, and they're just not intuitive at all. And I wonder if Jesus intensifies the fear, that he might intensify the attitude that complements that fear. You see how Jesus says this in verse 19. Jesus says, "Do not be anxious how you are to speak or what you are to say." And the disciples would have heard this as an audacious command. To be anxious is to be hyper-focused, to be overly concerned about something to such a degree that concern, it begins to own you. But look, I mean, even if there's just a remote chance of legal action against you, a remote chance of you experiencing public torture, a remote chance of political persecution, a remote chance of your exposure to death by your own family, isn't anxiety exactly what you'd feel? But Jesus, with no tongue-in-cheek at all, he says, do not be anxious. And second, notice this. And notice how Jesus insists that under these circumstances, rather than run away, he simply says in verse 22, the one who endures to the end will be saved. The word endure literally means to remain, to stay put. You see how in verse 23, Jesus says, flee to the next town? That's actually a different word, that word for flee. And Jesus isn't saying in verse 23 that you flee in order to avoid persecution. Look at verse 23 carefully. It's not to avoid persecution. It's after they have already been persecuted. If you survive, then go to the new town where it's going to happen all over again. The intuitive thing to do is to run away and avoid persecution entirely. But Jesus insists upon staying, upon waiting. And I want you to just imagine the disciples hearing this bleak future and being given these two commands that they would color their attitude. The attitudes that Jesus insists upon are actually beyond imagination. Public torture is a potential outcome. I will most certainly be anxious about what to say and how to make it stop. If I'm being dragged before a king, I will most certainly be anxious about what to say and how to make it stop. Embroiled in a conflict in which family relationships prove no safety and indeed will be dismantled before my very eyes, perhaps leading to my own death by a family member, I will be very anxious about what to say and how to make it stop. But Jesus tells his disciples, even as sheep amidst wolves, be calm and be patient. You know, all of us ought to ask, how can this be? You know, Jesus loves our difficult questions. Let's ask, how can this be? Before moving on from the attitude, let's notice what Jesus is really saying here. This attitude of calm patience is hard enough to exhibit in ordinary life. I mean, ordinarily, aren't we riddled through and through with wild anxiety and a desperate desire to escape life's busyness? I mean, this is what vacation is for. Anxiety and worry demands vacation. Frantic busyness demands vacation. When I engage in religious discussion in the polarized world, what do I do with my anxiety about what I'll say? And what do I do with my desire to look around the room for an escape hatch to deliver me from what looks like impending persecution? You remember in this passage how Jesus began. Let's look at it again in verse 16. I am sending you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. Sounds desperate, doesn't it? But I say this to you, that if you are a follower of Jesus, you are not just a sheep. You are his sheep. And as his sheep, you have not just a shepherd, you have the one true shepherd, the good shepherd. A disciple knows that they are not a sheep without a shepherd. They have a shepherd who knows them and a shepherd who knows the enemy. And you see this hinted at when he refers to synagogues and courts and kings. He is the one true Lord of all of those institutions. He is the king. And you see this reference with regards to families. He is your family. He is your brother, and he has drawn you into a family in which God the Father is your own father by adoption. And you see your task in verse 18. It's not your own task. Jesus, he is such a good shepherd that your job, according to verse 18, is to bear witness about him. When embroiled in court, you are not on trial. The shepherd is on trial. And all you're to do is to tell his story. He is the shepherd. Talk about him. And do you see how anxiety-inducing it will be to not know what to say? Well, look at verse 19. He'll tell you what to say in that hour, for it is not you who speak, but the Spirit of your Father. You have a very good shepherd. Look at verse 23. There is actually more work to do. There are more towns that need to hear the good news. Even in persecution, the shepherd is leading you to where you need to go. He's leading you through the persecution to the next opportunity to be persecuted. Why? Because the news is that good. You will not have gone through all the towns of Israel, Jesus says, before the Son of Man comes. Boy, verse 23, Now, that is a verse that spawns a great deal of controversy, but can I just lay this before you for you to consider? That when Jesus says that the Son of Man is coming, it's a reference to Daniel chapter 7, and it refers to Jesus' own death and resurrection and ascension. And Jesus is saying, from now until my ascension into heaven, there's work to be done. And brothers and sisters, there's still work to be done. Through the persecution, there are more to tell about the gospel of Jesus on the other side. Now, that's the first main point. I'm telling you, they get shorter and shorter. But move from attitude to verses 24 through 25, an attitude of calm patience. But what's the motivation? And the motivation is to be like Jesus. The attitude, despite the promised danger of dealing with wolves, is calm patience. But this is only possible because the sheep have a good shepherd. And in verse 24 through 25, Jesus shifts from the attitude to motivation. Yes, you'll be persecuted, but still victorious. Here's that motivation. Would you notice how in verse 24 that Jesus, he steps back from the experience of mission in order to tell them who they are. He tells them who they are. Just a Thursday of this week, Karen and I had a lot of middle students in our home, and I told those middle school students, I told them that we really do wonder where to go to find ourselves. That's true for these students. It's true for adults who profess faith in Jesus. We look all over the place to determine our identity, to find out who we are. We're so quick to build our identity by turning outward to earthly external sources like friends or grades or athletic abilities. Or we turn inward to find ourselves, our desires, our passions, our dreams about the future. When we ask ourselves the question, who am I? We're pretty quick to run all over the place trying to find an answer for that question. Or we're pretty quick to dive deep in our own heart to answer that question, who am I? But as Christians, we understand who we are by looking not at the world and not at ourselves, but we look at God. We study Him. He made me. He knows me. He loves me. He saved me. And He tells me who I am. And isn't this what we want our middle school students to believe? Isn't this what we want? Well, we want ourselves to believe. I learn about myself by learning about my God, and He tells me who I am. And here's the motivation for the disciples. You must be like Jesus. Verse 24, a disciple is not above his teacher, nor a servant above his master. It is enough for the disciple to be like his teacher and the servant to be like his master. What motivates, what can motivate calm patience amidst persecution in sharing the gospel? You're to be like Jesus. And when you're persecuted, you're becoming more like Him. And indeed, you will be persecuted. It really is astounding how we come to think that our lives are our own. I mean, just think about this. From a very young age, without even knowing it, we just automatically adopt a doctrine that my goal of life is to make my life great. My goal in life is to make my life more mine and more mine and more mine. And in fact, how could it be otherwise? We just imbibe this without even thinking. It is the doctrine of the world, and we come to embrace it as if it were the very gospel. How could it be otherwise? It makes such perfect sense. You ever stuffed a turkey for Thanksgiving? For Thanksgiving, that's my job. You stuff the turkey. And you know, we live our lives as if all of my life is about stuffing that life more and more full. That's life. You remember the parable in Luke 12 of the rich man whose crops they keep producing, and he builds barn after barn, and he expands barn after barn. He's stuffing the bird. That's all he's doing. He's just stuffing the bird. And on autopilot, that's exactly what we do. Our education, our status relative to others, our careers, our choice of spouse, our investments, our age-defying appearance, our vacations, our retirement, all of these, they become powerful motivators because the goal is to stuff my life. We're so busy stuffing the bird, we forget to look up at the shepherd and see that life is not our own. And the shepherd, because he loves us, tells us that. What a shame it would be if he never told us. And it hurts, but he's telling us. We are not our own. In fact, Jesus says this, it is enough. Is that not a wonderful word? It's enough. It's enough. Stop stuffing. It's enough to be like the teacher. It's enough to be like the master. It's enough to be like the shepherd. He was persecuted. You'll be persecuted. But you must be like him. And friends, it is enough. You know, it really is more than enough. Our motivation is not just in the gospel proclamation, but in all of life is to live lives like his. He was persecuted, so it's enough for me to be persecuted. After all, I can be like him in this life because I will be like him in the life to come. The Bible tells us that the resurrection of Jesus is the first fruit of our own resurrection. I can and must be like the shepherd in this life because my future resurrection will be like his resurrection. That's the motivation. And what's the hope? The hope is this. Verses 26 through 33 tell us that God will make all things known. Imagine how offensive it would be to the disciples for Jesus to command in verse 26, have no fear, right? I mean, you've just sent me out into the wolves. In verse 26, he says, have no fear of them. The them's the wolves. I'm sending you into a pack of wolves. Have no fear of the wolves. How heartless it is for Jesus to tell the disciples in verse 28, do not fear those who kill the body. That's like the definition of the kind of people you fear. The ones that do that. And Jesus says, do not fear the ones who kill the body. And then what pomposity of Jesus to insist in verse 31, fear not. It's a command. Fear not. He's sending them into a pack of wolves. He's assuring them of persecution that will likely destroy their reputation, constrain their earthly future, damage family harmony, and perhaps even lead to their death. And in all of this, they are to remain calm and patient. But the command, do not fear, that's going a step too far. Isn't it, Jesus? Isn't it? Have you ever experienced the difficulty of trying to encourage someone whose life is really bleak? When a dear friend or a family member's life is unraveling, something traumatic has come upon their lives in such a way that no one can debate that this is not traumatic. It is very bleak indeed. And in a situation like that where you're called to comfort them and no words are bubbling out of your mouth, how tempting isn't it to say, it'll be better tomorrow? Have you ever said that to someone? It'll be better tomorrow. I mean, you have no proof of that at all. It'll be better tomorrow. Have you been tempted to say, well, at least you can give it some time. And then the time heals all wounds, your wound too. Always? At least you have your health. Don't worry, be happy. I mean, you know what I'm after. You know, these promises present no cost to the encourager and no help to the one who desperately needs encouragement. On what basis can Jesus command, do not fear? It sounds heartless, doesn't it? But look at verse 26. Jesus says that nothing is covered that will not be revealed or hidden that will not be known. Everything one day is going to be made clear to the entire world. Our job in this life as a Christian is to bear witness to the shepherd, who he is and what he has done. We are ultimately, however, not the evangelist. You see, God is the evangelist. He will make the ultimate lasting proclamation. He will bear witness to himself before the entire world, because everything will be revealed. Everything will be made known. And when we become Christians, we're swept up into someone else's story. You know that, saints, don't you? Our entire lives as Christians is subsumed into God's own cosmic purposes. We have life because he swept us into his own life. We can have an attitude of calm patience among wolves because our life story has become a story not about ourselves, but a story about him. Our motivation is to be like Jesus because we already are like Jesus. We are in Christ, dead to sin, covered by his righteousness, alive in his resurrected life. We taste that now, and being swept into his story, our hope is not the final chapter of the book that we dreamed up in our heads. Our hope is not the final chapter that we can produce or usher in this earthly life. The final chapter of the book, our ultimate hope, is God's final chapter, when the whole world will know that he's the great author of the story of all stories, and he will be that storyteller. Yes, you will be but still victorious. The hope that you have is this: he'll one day tell the whole story himself to the sheep and to the wolves. And even now, he's already beginning to tell the story as you bear witness, as you patiently endure persecution, as you go to the next town, as you seek to be more like Jesus, and as you hope for the great revelation at the end. You're beginning to tell the story. And you're doing so in grainy black and white with poor sound quality. And when he tells it, it'll be vibrant and immersive and real. But here's where I want to conclude. The Christian is called to bear witness to Jesus, to tell the story of Jesus despite rejection, despite harm. And the Christian will likely be cast aside by many or most. And the audience will shift town after town. And perhaps over time, the Christian will actually feel more and more homeless in this present age. Their motivation, it'll come and go. And their hope, that'll come and go as well. But they will be victorious because, after all, they've been swept up into a story with Jesus in which all of the followers of Jesus will experience the victory of Jesus. But I want to end here. There's a message here for the wolves, not just the sheep. Wolves, you may not know it, and you certainly don't believe it, but you too already have been swept up into that story. You actually were never out of that story. God created you, and the life that you live, you actually live that life because he is sustaining that life. And keep this in mind, wolves. The church that you joke about, the church that you ignore, the church in which you find or you refuse to find your sanctuary, the church which you persecute, that church will be there at the revelation of all things. She, the church, will not go away. And at that great revelation, when Jesus returns, you will find that you have been circumscribed in God's story all along. You will find that the life that you lived was a life that you thought you made, but you really didn't. All along, that church had been inviting you to become a follower of Jesus, to exchange your carefully crafted life for a God-made life that will never end and always be abundant. You were already inside of God's story, but it will one day be revealed to you that your DIY life will not escape God's condemnation. He will judge. And there is hell for the wolves. Wolves know that Jesus came not to be served, but to serve. To give his life mercifully that even wolves might be saved. The saved are wolves made into sheep. And this is possible for you. You cannot escape his story. But you must follow Jesus to live in that story in eternal care. This is what battered and bloody Christians ought to be saying to you, even if it kills them. Christians will be persecuted in this present life, but they will be victorious. Wolves believe in Jesus and join them. Would you join me in prayer then?